What's going on with Gen Alpha? Throughout times, we hear constantly over and over again how technology is going to improve lives, especially for the children of the future. But increasingly, as we see the statistics and the way things are going down now, we're increasingly unsure about whether or not this is true, or we can even expect this to happen. In this video, we're going to be discussing the possible reasons and impacts of the current Gen Alpha situation, and why it's going to be a negative effect not only for Gen Alpha, but for society at large. In this video, we're going to also be using a few ideas borrowed from previous videos I've made, so be sure to check them out when they're mentioned. So, this video is going to be primarily focused on the youth of today, and what is Gen Alpha? So Gen Alpha is defined as the current generation from 2010 to 2025, and it's notable because it's the first generation to be exclusively born in the 21st century. So of course, Gen Z, for example, my generation, began slightly before the 2000s. And this is a generation with a lot of hope. It's the generation, quote unquote, destined to be the generation with the most technology and the most widespread technology use available, allowing them to reach new heights of civilizational success, and also to develop the most and be the most successful and happiest for themselves. But it's already clear that even Gen Z doesn't have the same prosperity promised to them 10s and 20s, 30 years ago. And that's due to, of course, a multitude of reasons, one being economical situations, but also the social situations that have resulted due to the very technology that's supposed to be helping us out. And one of these things is media exposure and the use of social media as a replacement for real life connections, and also the excessive use of internet and devices, which severely stunts childhood growth. The architecture of social media is mainly responsible. And again, before we get into what an iPad kid is, which is a term you may or may not have heard, first let's discuss why this matters. So the proliferation of technology, as we've discussed multiple times in the past, has its obvious benefits, right? More data processing, better access to information, all of these things. But these are important as productivity tools, right? If you're given a calculator from day one and you're told all of its functions, you're not going to understand what each of them do and why they're important and their application. Rather, you're going to be using the tool as a pathway to a place that you shouldn't be anyways. An interesting example to this is AI. For example, we always say, oh, AI is a tool and it won't replace high-level jobs because there's experts who, can't be replaced. But these experts are people who weren't born experts. These are people who went through if you're a lawyer, they went through the paralegal jobs. They went through the grunt work. But if that grunt work is replaced with AI and internet and all of these productivity tools, you're going to find that there's less experts and less people capable of the very best. So ultimately what this means is that while there is more potential for good and more potential for greater performance, there's an equally high chance of drawbacks and an equally proportionally higher amount of people who won't be doing what they should be, or aren't going to be accomplishing what they should. So now let's get into what an iPad kid is and what that means. So an iPad kid is a term used it's in the vernacular for children who are raised primarily not by their parents, but by time spent on the internet, usually in the form of an iPad. And this is an interesting, it's a new social phenomenon because it's more evident the more and more you see it. And what's interesting about the media, and people already say that daycare might be too far and getting away from the parenthood experience. But what makes the media and iPad kids different is that it's a very predatory system. We've already gone over many times how social media doesn't actually promote good things. It promotes what's loud, what's attention grabbing, what might be controversial, anger inducing, all of these things, anxiety inducing, right? And we're seeing all this play out in society today. And when there's not genuine control over what children are able to watch, all this loud hyper stuff is translating into a school environment, into a life's environment. And let's look at the definition of algorithms and the way it exploits the human dopamine receptors. The way you scroll and the way you interact with videos makes you accustomed to instant pleasure, that you should have access to everything instantly on a click or a touch or whatever. And this expectation is built up over years and months in children, and this has reflected severely on school. Now, many teachers have come out and say, especially for elementary and middle schoolers, that the current learning levels of these students are just absolutely terrible. Right? You have children who are unable to either read at a good level or do math, and it's a lot because of attention levels. Attention levels are dropping, attention spans are dropping, right? And what this is resulting in is that kids aren't able to actually interact with the learning environment in the way they should have because they don't have that built up. They don't have that resilience to, for example, boredom's built up. They don't have that patience built up, which learning requires. And this is, of course, tragic for the kids mainly. They're the ones losing out in the future. And I personally am very privileged and lucky to have had a youth where I was, exposed to a lot of reading in addition to whatever media I had. And it's clear Gen Alpha is currently, the older you get as Gen Alpha, you're going to have so much more screen time because you have more time and more access. And there's a few graphs out there that weren't really all encompassing, but I couldn't really bear myself to put it on here. But Gen Z and Gen Alpha have by far the highest screen time out of any generation currently on this earth. And that's pretty obvious, right? You're young, you have more time, but also you have more access and you're more in tune and you grew up with these things, especially if you're Gen Alpha, not so much Gen Z, right? Like having a phone when I was growing up wasn't a necessity. And I'm sure many of you remember, at least in the early 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s, that wasn't the case. A phone wasn't necessary. But today, from middle schools to maybe even elementary schools, depending on where you go, a phone is seen as a necessity for not only classroom projects, but for social media and life in general. It's a privilege to not have, actually. And we'll get into this very soon. And again, as we discussed, there's as much potential as there for getting more information and really grinding and getting full use and full potential and really milking internet and media and phones and electronics. There's just as much potential for this to fail. So this is a statistic from nationsreportcard.org, which says that in 2022, only a third of fourth graders in the United States scored at or above proficiency in reading. Now that's insane, right? 33% are able to read above a fourth grade level, or at least on par, when they're in fourth grade. And of course, I probably could have researched more deeply into this, but I've seen, and I'm sure you have seen, countless of news stories. Teachers are dismayed. They're leaving at the idea of disrespectful children who aren't able to actually interact with the learning environment, kids who aren't able to hold an attention span. And it's becoming more difficult as the younger you get to actually do this because these kids are so in tune with what's easy and the algorithm and the easy access to, I guess, dopamine in a way when it comes to social media. But there's a reason for this. And the reason isn't because there's some crazy scheme to target these children for the future, but there's two economics and social reasons, and we're going to focus on the parents. By all means, and there's no doubt, the parents are sort of at blame, partially at blame, for this effect being done to their children, right? These parents are the ones allowing and giving these iPads, quote unquote, to their children, allowing media use, and are unable to supervise them. But this isn't out of some malice or, sloth. It's because of the peculiar circumstances we find ourselves in the modern day. So to begin with some history, right? Initially, at least in the patriarchal model, it was always, the mother stays at home and is the homemaker, child rearer, right? While the father goes out to make work and make money to support his family. That was almost always the model in almost every large society that still remains today. And this was even true up until, I believe, like the 1940s, 1950s, when the economy was still designed in a way where a single family household could work. And one of course, the biggest things that our nation lacked during these times was suffrage and civil rights equality for both, race and sex issues. And during this time, women gained suffrage in the 1920s and then moved on to make it the women's right to work movement. And this was huge as it gave a lot of people autonomy and liberty that the government should have promised from the beginning. And there's no doubt that the amount of freedom and liberty that we chose to, as a society, to give women, right, which isn't something that's always been done throughout society, that was something that we as a society decided on. And it's had a mixed amount of good and bad effects, but ultimately the fact is that we wanted women to have liberty. The interesting part is that mainly the proponents of this this push for women to have to work rather than have the choice to work were wealthy industrial moguls who wanted a greater labor base. So economics-wise, if you have a greater population who could do labor, you have more competition, which means that wages will be lower, which means that the people in charge have more control over the people under them. And when you double the workforce all of a sudden by pressuring social situations, you have so much more power as an industrial tycoon. So that's not to say, of course, that there were earnest people working on grassroots later on, but the truth is the first wave of feminism was largely top down. It was people, usually wealthy men, trying to get women into the workforce, and you hear a lot from more classical feminists nowadays, but it never was. It was initially about the choice to work, but then it became the duty to work. There was shame in not working as a woman because you were somehow denying yourself independence. Anyways, what this led up to throughout the last 100 years is a serious imbalance in work. Because both families could work, companies can afford to lower wages, and see as of course inflationary cycles and things occurred, prices went up and actual wages fell down, necessitating both parents to work. So first we have a graph which is more relevant today than before, but monthly mortgage payments from 1989 to 2023. And this shows that even in the last 30 years, when things were supposed to be more stable and we're supposed to be used to this new labor cycle with women and men working, mortgage rates still went up. This isn't inflation adjusted. However, even if you do adjust for it, it still is a upwards trend at a very noticeable level. So that's the economic and social reason combined together, right? You have more people working because of a certain movement that caused the labor force to expand to necessitate. You can't only have, right? If, for example, if everyone's making less, you can't only have dad work. You have the mom work as well. And what this creates is a lot of people being raised in families where both parents are always working, right? You have people who are working hard, especially in the lower classes, to work 1, 2, maybe even 3 jobs, 4, even more to support their family. And this takes a lot of time and energy that cannot be spent at home to take care of their children. And from 1975 to 2015, you can see here that the share of both parents working went up dramatically. And of course, you can even imagine how more serious this was beforehand. And ultimately, what this is showing is that there's less and less care and availability and time that is able to be offered to children, especially at a very young age because of the demanding nature of it, which allows you to put these kids into daycares. And when you're home and you're with them, it's much easier to just give them the iPad or device because effort is hard. And that's, of course, as I said, not on the parents, right? It's not their fault that the economy is in such a way that they need to have both parents out working. But the social impacts on the children are very serious. It wasn't as clear back then or a while back because the daycare system was relatively developed, but even that had severe social effects that we haven't fully gotten the grasp of. But with the iPad kids, it's so much more evident. And that's because of the serious impact that social media and such has to people who aren't children, right? Even among adults, you see the negative impacts of social media, which we've already gone through a lot. So ultimately, what it comes down to isn't whether or not you're actually a good parent. It comes down to whether you're able to afford the time to stay at home for extended amounts of time and take care of your children. Because when you have more time and energy, and you're not going to be pressured to work so hard so often, and maybe even if you have the luxury of working at home, you have the time to take care of your kids in ways that people who are always the lower working classes aren't able to. And that's just a tragedy of the situations that we can't go back and change, and nor do I wish to change, because that's simply what a consequence of a choice we made 100 years ago. So therefore, I believe that the cause is ultimately the socio and economic situations that made both parents work, allowing, which resulted in less time spent at home, able to interact with their kids, and less energy to interact with their kids when they are at home. So I guess to sum it up, because it was a bit bloated and stuff, social and economic situations started about 100 years ago, caused the necessary situations which allowed for the proliferation of daycare, and then soon after, iPad kids, as a result of the fact that parents are unable to watch them at home or even be at home due to these extraneous economic circumstances. And what this has caused, and this part's a little bit more theoretical, is a growing gap. So like you see here, growing gap between the parents who work and parents who either neither parent works because they're still wealthy or they're unemployed, or one parent works. is that there's a growing gap in the quality, I guess, of the upbringing and education of Generation Alpha. As I said before in section 4, if you have both parents working all the time, you're going to be more likely to be a quote unquote iPad kid. Say if you have some other relative to help you out, or you have a bigger family, or a different support system that allows you to be connected socially. So these people affected at least, are going to have this sort of iPad kid upbringing, because you're going to have the certain such social situations that necessitate your parents to give you this iPad to not protect you as much from possible negative consequences and social consequences of being exposed to such things. Then you have the group of people who either have one parent working because one is the breadwinner, or one is simply at home due to some extraneous issue, and you're going to have a more normal upbringing. Obviously, many times this might be positive or negative, depending on whether your family's just simply not doing well, or you have someone, or you're doing exceedingly well. In this case, exceedingly well, you're going to have better social upbringing with more parental attention, which has been proven multiple times to be necessary to the human condition, whether it be birth or, foster parents, right? Stability is important, and being around your own parents is important, and that's very, very, very clear. So based on this, the children raised around these circumstances are going to be more successful and have a more better drive that isn't so tainted by this cycle of algorithm and addiction and social media. And this is more personal issue, but I've seen this all around me, right? I've volunteered a few times at like a middle school and elementary school, and it's more and more clear that there's a certain group of Generation Alpha, and to a certain degree Generation Z, which are just so much more driven than the others, while many are just simply stuck in this trap that aren't able to get out and are falling behind. And this is truly tragic, because this creates a large gap of like top versus bottom brass of the society, and this will in the future exacerbate inequality, because the people who are wealthy enough to afford to take care of their kids are going to have successful kids. And we discussed in the last video whether or not inheritance matters, but that question might not even matter, because these children are just more equipped to live a better life and make more money on their own, simply because even without inheritance, they inherited the time from their parents, or the time, or the even money to like afford a nanny, that might like a long-term nanny, right? So what does this say about Gen Alpha? What will happen to them? And the question is, no one knows, or the answer is no one knows, but we can make some predictions. So my prediction is that we're going to see a large tapering off of the bottom and top brass, right? For example, personal issue, but I have some friends in South Korea. There, the educational standards are so intense, as many of you might have heard, which results in people of lower intelligence just by nature, and people with lower work drive, to simply give up. They realize they're not going to be at the top because, it's very competitive, so they give up. There's a very small middle group where, okay, they try, but they're not trying to be the best. And then you have the top brass, the ones who put in all the effort, all the work to get into those top 5 universities that actually matter if you want to get into a large company like Samsung or LG, for example. And something similar, I believe, will happen. Those people who have been fortunate enough to be born into a situation where their family either has the time, money, or both to nurture them into actual members of society, they will have those children will have the best opportunity to succeed and will be that top class. Meanwhile, the families of people who are maybe not as advantaged, or maybe both parents are forced to work to even make a good living, maybe even upper middle class to have a good standard of living, but still living paycheck to paycheck, right? To maintain their standard of living. And these children will not have the same social opportunities, which will and has resulted in social stunting and severe differences in the psychology of those children and the children raised by one or both parents, depending on the circumstances. I think to a degree, COVID was both useful and, hurtful in this way, because many families with parents who were able to work remote jobs had more time around their children, which was definitely good. At the same time, the kids were at home and were forced to use their devices more, because what else was there to do, really? At the same time, there were families who couldn't afford to actually, continue, because not all jobs are remote, and these families suffered. So what's the takeaway? What will happen to Gen Alpha, as the question of the video suggests? Ultimately, it's going to be the fact that inequality will cause multiple issues and we're only going to see the issues, psychological issues of these children present themselves seriously in the future, right? We already have a grasp of the short-term effects of extended social media use, but only in the future will we fully grasp the possible consequences of this on our children. So, what do you think? I'll probably make a clickbait video for this. If you've already clicked, that's great. But yeah, recently the videos have been a bit harder to make given I only have so many ideas out here. It's already been 3 weeks. But anyways, if you have any criticisms, comments, thoughts, critiques, or you want to discuss anything here further, please feel free to reach out in the comment section down below. I'll be sure to respond quick as I can. So, thank you for watching. It's been Rhetoric Reviewed. Out.